In the scorching heart of the Sahara Desert, where temperatures climb to 130 degrees Fahrenheit and sand dunes stretch endlessly toward the horizon, a young girl sat waiting. Day after day, week after week, month after month. Her name was Amina, and she was waiting for something that most people had told her would never come. This is the story of impossible hope, unwavering faith, and the miracle that emerged from the most unforgiving landscape on earth. Could a child possibly be waiting for in a place so vast and empty? What secret did she hold that gave her such strength against the odds? The answers will not only surprise you, but might just change the way you see the world. Stick around as we begins not in the heart of the desert, but in a small village nestled on its edge. The village of Tindouf, a place where the determined green of palm trees meets the endless yellow sea of sand. This is where 12-year-old Amina lived with her grandmother. Her mother had passed away when she was just a small child, only 5 years old. Her father, a merchant trader, had left 3 years earlier on what was meant to be a routine journey across the desert for the coastal cities. But he never came back. The last thing he ever told Amina was simple, yet it became the very anchor of her existence. He knelt down, looked her directly in the eyes, and said, "If I'm ever late coming home, wait for me at the old acacia tree. No matter how long it takes, I will find you there." The old acacia tree stood alone, a 3-hour walk into the vast desert from their village. It was a well-known mark for all the traders, a single navigational point in the shifting sea of sand. Her father had taken her there many times, teaching her about the stars, showing her how to read the desert winds. 2 long years passed with no word. The village elders, wise and weathered, declared him lost, likely dead. The desert, they would say with a somber shake of their heads, claims many lives and rarely gives them back. Sandstorms, bandits, dehydration, venomous snakes. There are 100 ways to die out there, and only a sliver of luck to survive. But Amina, with a steadfast heart, refused to believe it. On the morning of her 14th birthday, Amina made a decision. She filled a leather water pouch, packed a small satchel with dried dates and flatbread, and turned her face towards the desert. Her grandmother, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear, tried to stop her. She called it foolishness. She called it suicide. But there was something in Amina's eyes, a quiet, unshakable resolve, that made her grandmother finally step aside. It was a look that said, clear as day, "My mind is made up." The acacia tree was ancient, its gnarled, twisted branches forming a sparse canopy that offered only minimal shade from the relentless sun, but for Amina, it was enough. She sat beneath it, her back pressed against the rough bark of the trunk, and she waited. The first day was the easiest. Her spirit was still buoyed by the enthusiasm of belief, the fresh determination of her purpose. She watched the horizon in every direction, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any dust cloud that might signal a returning caravan. But the desert is a master of illusion. Heat mirages created phantom lakes on the horizon, made distant dunes shimmer and dance as if alive. Several times her heart leaped as she thought she saw a caravan approaching, only to realize it was just an illusion, a trick played by the bending light. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange, pink, and purple, Amina walked the long 3 hours back to the village. She would return tomorrow. And she did. Day after day, Amina made the journey. It became a ritual, a sacred routine. She would wake before dawn, when the desert air still held the cool of the night. She'd walk with a steady, purposeful pace, conserving her precious energy and water. She would arrive at the acacia tree just as the sun began its powerful ascent into the sky, and there she would sit. She would watch. She would wait. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon once more, she would return. The villagers began to talk. Their whispers followed her through the narrow streets. Some called her devoted, a paragon of filial piety. Others, less kind, called her disturbed, lost in a fantasy. Her grandmother worried constantly, her face etched with concern, but she didn't try to stop her again. Perhaps, she thought, this was simply Amina's way of processing her profound grief. Perhaps in time she would grow tired of the waiting, accept the harsh reality, and finally move on. But the weeks bled into months, and Amina showed no sign of stopping. Her daily pilgrimage continued, unwavering. She became a fixture of the landscape, as permanent and resilient as the ancient acacia tree itself. Passing traders on their long treks across the sand would see her there, a small, solitary figure beneath the sprawling branches. They began to tell stories about her in the bustling markets of distant cities. Stories of the girl who waits, the daughter of the lost merchant. A legend in the making. Some, moved by her quiet vigil, would leave her small gifts of water or food. Others would simply shake their heads in pity or disbelief and continue on their way. Amina's body adapted to the harshness of the desert. Her skin, once soft, became tanned and leathery from the constant exposure to the sun and wind. Her eyes, once filled with the innocence of youth, now held the ancient, far-seeing gaze of a desert nomad. She learned to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, the scuttling tracks of a scarab beetle, the flight pattern of a desert falcon, the subtle shift in the wind that foretold a coming sandstorm. The desert was no longer just a vast, empty space to her. It was a living entity with its own language, its own rhythms. One day, a wealthy merchant, his caravan laden with silks and spices, stopped by the acacia tree. He was an old man with kind eyes who remembered her father. He had heard the stories. "Child," he said gently, "your father was a good man. But it has been 5 years. The desert has claimed him. Come with us to the city. You can have a new life, a good life. There's nothing for you here but sand and sorrow." Amina looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. She thanked him for his kindness, but politely refused. "I made a promise," she said simply. The merchant sighed, left her a generous supply of food and water, and his caravan moved on, leaving her once again in her solitary world. Her vigil continued through the changing seasons. The scorching heat of summer gave way to the biting cold of winter nights. She endured sandstorms that blotted out the sun for days, huddling against the trunk of the tree, her face wrapped in cloth as the world turned into a howling vortex of sand. She learned to find water, digging in dry riverbeds where she knew moisture still lingered deep beneath the surface. She learned which roots were edible, which insects were safe to eat. She was no longer just waiting, she was surviving. She had become a child of the desert, years past. Amina was no longer a girl of 14. She was a young woman of 20. The villagers had long since stopped talking about her. Her grandmother had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 winters prior. Amina was now truly alone. Her daily journey to the tree was no longer a conscious decision, but an instinct, as natural as breathing. The hope in her heart, once a burning flame, had tempered into a steady, glowing ember. It was no longer a frantic hope for an immediate return, but a deep, abiding faith. A faith in her father, in his promise. One late afternoon, as the sun began to cast long shadows across the dunes, she saw something. It wasn't a mirage, it was real. A single figure, stumbling, staggering across the sand. It was a man, gaunt and weathered, his clothes little more than tattered rags. He walked with a limp, using a sturdy branch as a crutch. He was still a great distance away, a tiny speck against the vastness, but there was something familiar in his silhouette and the way he moved. Amina's heart, which had beaten with a slow, steady rhythm for so long, began to pound in her chest. She stood up, her eyes straining, every fiber of her being focused on the approaching figure. Could it be, after all this time? She didn't dare to run towards him. The desert had taught her patience, taught her not to trust her eyes completely. So she stood and she waited as the man drew closer and closer. He was old now, his hair and beard a stark white against his sun-darkened skin. His face was a roadmap of hardship, etched with deep lines of pain and survival. But as he looked up, his eyes found hers. And in those eyes, weary and aged as they were, she saw it. The same love, the same recognition, the same spirit she had carried in her memory for all these years. He stopped a few feet from her, leaning heavily on his crutch. A slow smile spread across his cracked lips. "I told you," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, "that I would find you here." Tears streamed down Amina's face, washing away years of dust and waiting. She ran to him, and they embraced under the branches of the old acacia tree, two souls reunited by an unbreakable promise in the heart of the unforgiving desert. His journey had been one of unimaginable hardship, capture by bandits, years of servitude, a daring escape. He had lost everything, but he had kept his promise. And Amina, the girl who waited, had finally found her reward. Her vigil was over. Her father was home. Thank you for watching. 6 months passed. 6 long months under the relentless sun, and something inside Amina began to shift. The desert, once a vast, terrifying enemy, was slowly becoming something else. A companion, a teacher. It was becoming her home. She started to understand its language. She learned to read the wind. When it blew from the northeast, she knew cooler, more comfortable days were on their way. But when a hot, dry breath came from the south, it was a warning. A sandstorm was coming. This knowledge gave her time to find shelter, to wrap her face in cloth and hunker down until the storm passed. Her survival skills sharpened. When her own food supplies ran dangerously low, she learned which insects were safe to eat, their crunchy bodies providing just enough protein to sustain her. She discovered which thorny, unassuming plants held precious drops of moisture hidden in their deep roots, a lifeline in the arid landscape. Even the acacia tree, the very reason for her vigil, seemed to sense her presence. It was no longer just a landmark. It was her confidant. She would talk to it for hours, her voice a soft murmur against the silence. She told it stories of her father, his laughter, his strength. She sang the old songs her mother had taught her long ago, her voice carrying on the wind. And sometimes, in the gentle rustling of its few remaining leaves, she felt a response, a whisper of understanding. Her solitude was gradually broken by the arrival of others. Travelers, merchants, and nomads began to seek her out. But they no longer looked at her with pity, the way her own villagers had. They saw something different. They saw wisdom. She could predict weather patterns with an accuracy that baffled them. She knew the safest routes through the ever-shifting dunes. She could spot the faint dust clouds of approaching caravans on the horizon hours before anyone else. One day, a wealthy trader, his camels laden with spices and silks, stopped to rest. He watched her for a long time before finally asking, "How do you do it? How do you know so much about this place?" Amina smiled, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "The desert teaches those who listen," she replied softly. "And I have nothing but time to listen." But it wasn't always so serene. There were dark days, too. Days when doubt, cold and sharp as the desert night, would creep into her heart. The logical part of her mind, the part that remembered the world beyond the dunes, would scream at her. It called her a fool, insisted that this was all insanity. It told her that her father was gone, truly gone, and that she was wasting her life, chasing the ghost of a promise made by a dead man. The vigil, which had once felt so purposeful, now seemed like a self-inflicted punishment. One brutal afternoon, 8 months into her wait, during the suffocating peak of summer, Amina finally broke. The heat was a physical blow, shimmering off the sand and waves that distorted the world. Her water supply was nearly gone, just a few precious warm drops left in her water skin. Her body ached with a deep, persistent weariness from months of walking, sitting, and simply waiting. And in that moment, the immense weight of her grief, her hope, and her exhaustion crashed down on her all at once. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure agony that was swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. She screamed at her father for leaving her, for placing this impossible burden on her shoulders. She screamed at herself for her foolish, childish belief. She screamed at God, at the universe, for the sheer cruelty of hope, a flickering candle that refused to be extinguished, only to burn her again and again. Why am I doing this? She cried out to the vast, indifferent sky, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. Why won't anyone just tell me the truth? Just tell me he's dead so I can stop this, so I can finally go home. The desert offered no reply. There was only the profound, deafening silence, punctuated by the soft whisper of wind over sand. Her rage spent, she collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, a profound realization washed over her, calming the storm inside. She wasn't waiting because she was certain her father would return. The certainty had faded long ago. She was waiting because the act of waiting itself had become her purpose. It had taken the lost, grieving child she was and forged her into someone new. Someone with direction, with meaning. The waiting had given her life a rhythm, a structure. It had connected her to the land, to the sky, to something far larger and more ancient than herself. She finally understood. She wasn't just waiting for her father anymore. She was waiting for the person she was becoming. Word of the girl at the acacia tree traveled on the desert winds, carried by merchants and pilgrims. Her story spread far beyond her small village, beyond the familiar trading routes, reaching distant towns and nomadic camps. People began to make journeys, sometimes traveling for weeks just to see her. They called her the Desert Oracle or the Patient One. Some came out of simple curiosity, wanting to lay eyes on the woman who had become a living legend. Others came seeking inspiration, their own lives filled with uncertainty and loss. And a few came because they too were waiting for something, for someone. They wanted to be near a person who truly understood the heavy, sacred burden of hope. Slowly, organically, a small community began to form around the lone acacia tree. It became a new kind of oasis. Travelers would stop not just to rest their weary bodies and water their animals, but to sit with Amina. They would share their own stories of love and loss, of journeys started and destinations unknown. In the shared patience and the quiet companionship, they found a unique kind of solace. Someone, a stonemason on his way to a new city, built a small, sturdy shelter of stacked rocks near the tree, offering better shade from the brutal sun. Others would leave supplies, a skin of fresh water, a bag of dates, a warm blanket for the cold nights. Without her ever asking, they ensured she had what she needed, that she was safe. Amina had become a symbol, though she never intended to be. In a world that was growing faster, more impatient, she was a symbol of faith. In an age of instant gratification, she was a symbol of patience. In a culture that often encouraged people to move on and forget, she was a symbol of the profound human capacity to endure, to remember, to honor a promise. One evening, as the stars began to blanket the sky, an old Tuareg nomad sat with her. His face, weathered by a lifetime in the desert, was wrapped in the traditional indigo blue cloth, leaving only his kind, knowing eyes visible. He had traveled hundreds of miles, he explained, crossing vast, empty stretches of the Sahara just to meet her. Why? Amina asked, her voice soft. Why would you travel so far? The old man looked at the acacia tree, then back at her. Because, he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, you remind us of a forgotten truth. You remind us that waiting is not a passive act. It is not emptiness. Waiting is an act of profound courage. In a world that constantly screams at us to give up, To move on, to forget the past, you choose to remember. You choose to honor a promise. That is a rare and sacred thing. It was the 13th month. 13 months of walking. 13 months of waiting. The acacia tree had become her entire world. It was her church, her monastery, her quiet meditation chamber. The endless cycle of sunrise and sunset had blurred into one long moment as she no longer bothered to count the days. Time had lost its rigid structure, becoming a fluid, meaningless thing in the eternal present of the desert. She had learned to read the subtle language of this barren land, the whisper of the wind, the shifting colors of the sand, the silent march of the stars. Her life was stripped down to its very essence, breathing, watching, and waiting. But on this particular morning, something felt different. Amina couldn't explain it, but a strange energy hummed in the air. It tasted different on her tongue, carrying a scent she couldn't quite place. The early morning light seemed to fall at an unusual angle, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like phantoms. Even the birds, rare visitors to this desolate place, circled high overhead in strange, unfamiliar patterns. A sense of anticipation, sharp and electric, prickled at her skin. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to have in a very long time, a dangerous flicker of hope in the vast emptiness. She sat in her usual spot, her back pressed against the rough bark of the acacia tree, her eyes methodically scanning the horizon. It was a ritual she performed countless times a day. East, where the sun was born, west, where it died. North and south, stretching into infinity. There was nothing. Just the endless sea of sand meeting the pale, washed-out sky in a shimmering, unbroken line. It was the same view she had seen for over a year, a landscape that had become as familiar as her own reflection. Yet today, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the precipice of something momentous, and then she saw it. A faint disturbance in the west, a tiny smudge against the perfect clarity of the horizon. It wasn't a mirage. She had learned to distinguish the desert's illusions from reality. This was real. Something was moving. A small cloud of dust, stirred up from the desert floor, was slowly making its way toward her. Amina's heart, which had been beating in a slow, steady rhythm for months, suddenly began to race. A wild, chaotic drumbeat against her ribs. She had seen countless dust clouds over the past year. Caravans of traders, noisy off-road vehicles, the terrifying approach of a sandstorm. None of them had been him. Each one had been a fresh wave of disappointment crashing against the shores of her hope. She forced herself to breathe, deep, steadying breaths. She couldn't let hope overwhelm her reason, not again. Hope was a cruel master in the desert, promising an oasis where there was only more sand. The dust cloud grew larger, closer, its form becoming more defined. And then, emerging from the swirling veil of sand and sun, she could finally make out shapes, figures. A small group of people, on foot, their movements slow and labored as they struggled through the deep, soft sand. Her breath caught in her throat. As they drew nearer, Amina slowly rose to her feet, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She squinted against the harsh glare of the sun, her hand shielding her eyes, trying to make out the details. There were 3 figures, no 4. One of them was being supported by the others, their bodies slumping, clearly injured or terribly ill. Her heart sank a little. This was likely just another group of desperate travelers seeking refuge, but she kept watching, and then she saw him. It was a subtle thing at first, the way he walked, the set of his shoulders, the familiar tilt of his head even from this distance. The world around her fell silent. The wind, the birds, the frantic beating of her own heart, all of it faded away. There was only that figure, a silhouette against the sun, moving slowly but deliberately toward her. After 13 months of silence and stillness, her world exploded into motion. It was him. He was thinner than she remembered, much thinner. His skin was weathered, burned dark by years of unrelenting sun. His hair, once a deep, solid black, was now streaked with gray, like silver threads woven through the night. He limped heavily, one leg clearly damaged, dragging with each painful step. But his eyes, when they met hers across the diminishing distance, they were the same eyes. The same gentle, warm eyes she had etched into her memory. Her father. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, neither of them moved. It was as if time itself had suspended, the desert holding its breath, the very air still and silent. Then the spell broke. Amina ran. She ran faster than she ever had in her life, her feet barely seeming to touch the hot sand. She didn't slow, didn't hesitate, crashing into him with such force that he staggered back, nearly falling. He would have fallen if his companions hadn't reached out to steady him. "Amina," he whispered, his voice cracked and broken, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You waited. You actually waited." She was crying too hard to speak, her body racked with sobs she couldn't control. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had rehearsed what she would say, what she would do. But now, all those carefully practiced words had vanished, washed away by the overwhelming reality of his presence, his solidity, his life. He was here, he was real. He held her, and through his own tears, he began to tell her what had happened. It was a story that began 3 years ago, just 3 weeks into his journey. His caravan had been ambushed by bandits. It was swift, brutal. Most of the merchants were killed. He was taken prisoner, along with a handful of others, and sold into forced labor. They were taken to an illegal mining operation, hidden deep in the mountains, a place far from any known trade routes, a black hole on the map where people simply disappeared. For 2 years, he had tried to escape. Again and again, he planned, he watched, he waited for an opportunity. And for 2 years, every single attempt had failed. The punishment was severe. Men who tried to run were beaten, sometimes to the point of death. It was a place designed to crush the human spirit, a place where hope went to die. But he never stopped thinking about Amina, not for a single day. He never stopped remembering the promise he had made to her, his last words before he left. "If I'm ever late coming home, wait for me at the old acacia tree." That promise became his lifeline. Finally, in his 3rd year of captivity, a chance came. It wasn't one he created, but one the desert itself provided. A sandstorm of unimaginable ferocity hit the mining camp. It tore through the makeshift structures, ripping them apart in the chaotic, blinding wind. In the confusion, he and 3 other prisoners managed to slip away into the storm. They had nothing. No supplies, no map, no clear sense of direction. All they had was the stars to guide them and a desperate, burning will to survive. The journey back took 4 months. 4 long, grueling months of walking across an unforgiving landscape. They learned to find water where there seemed to be none, to eat whatever insects or roots they could scavenge. They watched in despair as one of their companions succumbed to infected wounds, his body too weak to go on. He admitted he had nearly given up 100 times, the exhaustion and hopelessness threatening to swallow him whole. "But I kept thinking," her father said, his voice now barely above a whisper as he held her close. "What if she's there? What if she really waited? What if I give up now, and she's been there all along, all this time?" That single thought became his mantra, his fuel. It pushed him forward when his body screamed to stop, so he kept walking and walking until finally the familiar landmarks of his home began to appear on the horizon, until he saw the silhouette of the old acacia tree in the distance, until he saw his daughter, a small figure standing beneath its branches, waiting, just as he had asked, just as she had promised. When Amina and her father finally returned to the village, the air exploded with celebration. It was a miracle, a blessing from the heavens, a story that would be whispered from one generation to the next. Her grandmother, her face etched with a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief, wept tears of pure joy. She held Amina and her father in a tight embrace, as if she feared they might vanish into thin air if she let go. The entire village was swept up in the euphoria, but amidst the joyous chaos, Amina felt a strange and unexpected emotion creeping in, a sense of dissonance, of being out of step with the world. For 13 long months, her entire being, her very identity, had been woven into the act of waiting. Waiting had defined her days, shaped her thoughts, and fueled her spirit. It was the sole purpose of her existence. But now, the waiting was over. The purpose had been fulfilled. A disquieting question echoed in the chambers of her heart. Who was she now? The girl who waited no longer had a reason to wait. The very foundation of her recent life had crumbled away, leaving her standing on uncertain ground. Her father's recovery was a slow, arduous journey. The leg that had been broken in the unforgiving desert would never fully heal. A slight limp would forever be a reminder of his ordeal. But with the gentle care of his family and the slow passage of time, his strength gradually returned. He would often look at Amina, his eyes filled with a sense of wonder and awe. He marveled at the transformation she had undergone. The frightened, uncertain 12-year-old girl he had left behind was gone. In her place stood a strong, wise, and remarkably centered young woman. The desert, he thought, had forged her into this new person. "The desert made you," he said to her one quiet evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. Amina looked at him, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "No," she corrected softly, her voice carrying a newfound wisdom. "The waiting made me." In the months and years that followed, Amina's story became a local legend. People traveled from far and wide, from neighboring villages and even distant cities, seeking to meet the girl who had waited. They came to hear her story firsthand, to understand the source of her unwavering resolve. Amina was always gracious, always willing to share the lessons she had learned under the vast silent sky. But she always made sure to clarify one crucial point. The most important lesson, she would tell them, wasn't about her father's miraculous return. It wasn't about the joyous reunion that had brought the village to its knees in gratitude. It was something deeper, something more personal. "Everyone asks me if I knew he would come back," she would often say to the eager faces gathered around her. "They want to know if I had unshakable faith, if I possessed some kind of divine certainty. But the truth is, I didn't. I never knew for sure." She would let that sink in, the honesty of her words hanging in the air. "There were days," she'd continue, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "when I was absolutely certain he was dead. Days when I thought I was insane for continuing to wait, for clinging to a sliver of hope that seemed to shrink with each passing sunrise." Inevitably, someone in the crowd would ask the question that burned in all their minds. "Then why did you do it? Why did you keep waiting?" Amina would pause, gathering her thoughts, her gaze sweeping over the curious eyes before her. "Because," she would answer, her voice clear and steady, "the waiting wasn't really about him. It was about honoring a promise I made. It was about choosing to believe that faithfulness matters, that devotion has its own intrinsic value, even when logic and reason scream otherwise. It was about becoming the kind of person who keeps their word, not just to others, but to themselves, even when no one is watching, even when the world thinks you are a fool." She would let another moment of silence pass, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then she would add the final crucial piece of her revelation. "And I learned that waiting is not the same as being passive. Waiting is an active state. Waiting is a discipline. It requires you to show up every single day, to tend to the flame of hope, even when it's flickering. Waiting requires courage." Amina's story, like a seed carried on the desert wind, spread far beyond the confines of her small village. It was told in bustling cities and quiet towns, translated into different languages, and adapted into different contexts. And no matter who heard it, no matter their background or circumstances, they recognized something profoundly universal in her tale. They recognized themselves. Because the truth is, we're all waiting for something. We are all living in that space between what is and what could be. We are waiting for answers to questions that keep us up at night. We are waiting for healing for our bodies and our hearts to mend. We are waiting for a love that sees us, a love that stays. We are waiting for justice in an unjust world. We are waiting for change, for a breakthrough, for a sign that things will get better. And perhaps most importantly, we are waiting for the courage to change ourselves. The fundamental question of our lives, then, is not whether we should wait. Waiting is an inescapable part of the human condition. The real question is, what do we become while we wait? What character is forged in the crucible of our anticipation? Do we become bitter and resentful, our hearts hardening with each passing day? Or do we become wise, our perspective deepening with patience? Do we become isolated, pulling away from the world in our private vigil? Or do we become more connected, finding common ground with others in our shared human experience of longing? Do we become passive spectators in our own lives, letting circumstances dictate our fate? Or do we become purposeful, using the time of waiting as a period of active growth and preparation? Amina had been presented with this choice, and in the vast, empty expanse of the desert, she had chosen transformation. The desert had been her classroom, patience had been her teacher, and the waiting itself, that long, arduous, and uncertain journey, had been the ultimate lesson. She taught us that the waiting is never just empty time. It is the space where we decide who we are going to be. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of the human spirit. Until next time. Today, if you travel through that region of the Sahara, you will still find the old acacia tree. It's dying now, as all things must, but it endures. And around it, there is a small garden maintained by the local community. A place of rest for travelers, a place of reflection for pilgrims. And if you ask the locals about it, they will tell you the story of Amina, the girl who waited in the desert. They will tell you about faith and patience, about promises kept and prayers answered. But they will also tell you something else. They will tell you that the real miracle wasn't that her father came back. The real miracle was that she waited. That she chose to be the kind of person who honors commitments, who believes in impossible things, who transforms suffering into strength. Because in the end, we don't always control what happens to us. We don't always control whether our waiting ends in reunion or disappointment, but we always control who we become while we wait. Amina taught us that waiting is not wasted time. Waiting is where we discover who we really are. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, waiting brings us exactly what we hope for. But even when it doesn't, even when the waiting ends in heartbreak instead of miracle, we can emerge from it transformed, strengthened, refined by the fire of patience. The desert makes no promises, but it always teaches. And Amina was willing to learn. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, whatever you're waiting for, make the waiting count, make it transformative, make it meaningful. Because the person you become while waiting is just as important as what you're waiting for.